Do you believe you are immune? Immune to propaganda? To being fascinated by ideologies that push you to trade a piece of freedom and democracy for a few extra euros? And perhaps not even for that. Before you answer, think carefully. Even the citizens of Germany, Italy, and Russia in the 1920s and 1930s believed they were immune. Yet, in less than a generation, they sank into the nightmares that we now study in history books. This video is not just a story of the past, it is a mirror. We will analyse 8 of the most brutal dictatorships of the 20th century, both right-wing and left-wing, to understand which psychological and social mechanisms transform ordinary people into followers and victims of totalitarian regimes. But above all, at the end of the video, we will ask ourselves 2 fundamental questions. What made it possible for these dictators to seize power? And most importantly, are these conditions reappearing today? Welcome to Amazing Europe. Over 3,000 deaths. This was not the toll of an official war, but of a real undeclared civil war that shook Italy after the First World War. Italy officially emerged as the victor, yet in reality, it was a humiliated winner under the peace treaties, and it turned into a powder keg. On one side, workers and peasants, inspired by the Russian Revolution, occupied factories and lands. On the other side, nationalists, war veterans, and middle-class citizens terrified by the Red Menace. Amid this daily violence, one man promised to use an iron fist to impose order: Benito Mussolini. His rise did not occur through elections, but through the organised brutality of his black shirts. These paramilitary squads, financed by industrialists and landowners, unleashed a campaign of terror, destroying socialist headquarters and beating opponents. Violence created chaos, and Mussolini presented himself as the only solution. The final act was the March on Rome in October 1922. Not a military conquest, but an immense threat. As thousands of fascists moved toward the capital, the government asked King Victor Emmanuel III to sign a state of siege and stop them with the army. The king, fearing a large-scale civil war, or worse, that the army might side with the fascists, refused. Instead of using force, he handed Mussolini the task of forming a new government, believing he could control him. It was a fatal mistake. Once he became Duce, Mussolini dismantled democracy piece by piece. Political parties abolished, press muzzled, and the murder of Deputy Giacomo Matteotti, who dared to denounce him. His vision was total control, his worst practices ranging from the Ovra secret police to the indoctrination of children and the infamous 1938 racial laws against the Jews. The alliance with Hitler, of whom he had initially been a model, dragged him into a disastrous Second World War. Overwhelmed by military defeats, he was deposed in 1943 and executed 2 years later, marking the end of Europe's first fascist experiment. But fascism had been born as a brutal reaction to a fear, the fear of the Red Menace. And while Italy was sinking into its black nightmare, in the east, that red nightmare was already building its own empire of terror. 18 million people. This is the estimated number of human beings swallowed by the Gulag, the infernal archipelago of Soviet forced labour camps. The 1917 revolution had promised a paradise for workers, yet from the ashes of the Russian Empire emerged a man of steel, a ruthless bureaucrat who turned utopia into a totalitarian nightmare: Joseph Stalin. At Lenin's death, Stalin was already a master of intrigue in the shadows. Using his position as General Secretary, he placed his loyalists in every corner of the Communist Party, isolating and eliminating every rival. Once he had secured absolute power, he used it to forge the Soviet Union with unprecedented brutality. His vision was accelerated modernization at any human cost. His worst practices began in the countryside. In Ukraine, forced collectivization turned into genocide. The Holodomor, extermination by hunger, was not an accidental famine, but a weapon. Stalin confiscated every grain of wheat to crush Ukrainian nationalism and to sell the harvest abroad, financing his industry. Borders were sealed. Millions of people were left to starve. Then, in the paranoid delirium of the Great Purges, he unleashed terror against the party itself, the army, and ordinary citizens. Show trials, confessions extracted under torture, and a bullet to the back of the head became the norm, while an obsessive cult of personality elevated him to the status of a deity. Yet the greatest contradiction of his regime emerged with the war. In 1939, Stalin signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with his ideological nemesis. In secret, the agreement provided for the partition of Poland, effectively giving Hitler the green light to start the Second World War. But when Hitler betrayed the pact and invaded the USSR in 1941, it was the Soviet people who paid the highest blood price to stop the Nazi advance, fighting all the way to Berlin. Stalin died in his bed in 1953, a tyrant feared until the very end. But that temporary alliance he had forged for convenience was with a regime that had elevated racial purity and mass extermination to its own chilling reason for existence. 6 million Jews. This is not a number, it is an abyss. To understand how an entire civilized nation could fall into this abyss, we must go back to Germany. After the First World War, the country was a ghost. The burning humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, with its war guilt clause and its impossible reparations, had crushed national pride. Mad hyperinflation, with people burning banknotes for warmth, and the Great Depression of 1929 had thrown millions into despair. In this swamp of rage, a former Austrian corporal promised revenge, pride, and a culprit for every evil: Adolf Hitler. Hitler admired Mussolini and copied his script, but with a terrifying difference. If fascism was the dictatorship of the state, Nazism was the dictatorship of an ideology built on racial purity. Unlike Mussolini, Hitler did not march on Berlin. He exploited the Weimar Republic, the fragile and chaotic German democracy born from defeat, in order to destroy it from within. For the conservative establishment, industrialists, aristocrats, and the aging President Hindenburg, the absolute nightmare was communism. It meant the end of private property, the expropriation of their industries, the destruction of their world. Compared to that, Hitler was a coarse and vulgar radical, but he had two advantages in their eyes. He was a fanatical nationalist, and he hated communists more than anyone else. Their plan was cynical and desperate. Appoint him chancellor, surround him with trusted ministers, and use him as a battering ram to crush the left, convinced that they could later manipulate or discard him. It was the most catastrophic miscalculation of the century. Once in power, Hitler acted with lightning speed. The burning of the parliament was the pretext to abolish every freedom. With the Enabling Act, he granted himself the right to rule alone. He eliminated all opposition, first external, then internal, within his own party during the Night of the Long Knives. And upon Hindenburg's death, he proclaimed himself Führer, absolute leader. From there, he unleashed his project: the Gestapo, the concentration camps, and the Shoah, the industrialization of death planned in the gas chambers. His pursuit of living space ignited the Second World War, ending in his suicide. Yet his invasion of the Balkans had lit an unquenchable fire. In the mountains, the partisan war against the Nazi invaders was forging a new kind of leader and a new, complex multi-ethnic state. 7 peoples, 6 republics, 5 nations, 4 languages, 3 religions, 2 alphabets, and 1 single leader. This was the riddle used to describe Yugoslavia, a mosaic nation born out of the Balkan powder keg. And the man who forged it, uniting it with an iron fist, was a charismatic and ruthless partisan leader, Josip Broz Tito. While Nazi Germany and its Ustasha allies ravaged his homeland, Tito led the most effective resistance movement in Europe. Once the country was liberated, he immediately stained himself with ruthless crimes, such as the Foibe massacres, in order to eliminate every opponent. He built a communist state, but he refused to be Stalin's puppet. His resounding no to Moscow in 1948 turned him into a heretic of the Soviet bloc and the founder of the non-aligned movement. Yet, behind the facade of the world statesman, there was the dictator. His motto was brotherhood and unity, imposed with the force of the secret police. His worst practices were brutal. For opponents, especially the Stalinists after the break with Moscow, there was the prison island of Goli Otok, a hell of forced labour and psychological torture. Every form of nationalism, such as the Croatian Spring of 1971, was mercilessly crushed. And yet, his was not a suffocating totalitarianism. Yugoslavs could travel abroad, listen to rock music, and watch Western films. It was a dictatorship with an apparently human face, but still a dictatorship, a complex balance between repression and relative freedoms. The problem was that the state was him. At his death in 1980, the glue that held the mosaic together dissolved. The nationalisms he had suppressed exploded, leading to the terrible wars of the 1990s. His death unleashed hell, but at the far end of the continent, another strong man, a generalissimo born out of an equally brutal civil war, was aging in his bed. And his passing would lead his nation down a completely different path. Hundreds of thousands of deaths. This was not only the toll of the Spanish Civil War, but also of the ruthless repression that followed. To understand the rise of Francisco Franco, one must look at the Spain that came before him. Not a nation, but a battlefield on the brink of collapse. The Second Republic was a powder keg of irreconcilable extremes. On one side, the radical left, especially anarchists and communists, launched a systematic assault against the symbol of the old order, the church. It was not just protests, it was the desecration of tombs, the burning of convents, the summary execution of thousands of priests, nuns, and faithful, sometimes with unheard-of brutality. In the countryside, large estates were occupied. In the cities, workers took control of factories, dreaming of a Soviet-style revolution. On the other side, the reactionary right responded with its own brutality. It was a spiral of hatred that was tearing the country apart. In this vortex of hatred, Franco's military coup appeared as the brutal reaction to an imminent revolution. After 3 years of atrocious conflict, supported by Hitler and Mussolini, he won. His was not a revolutionary ideology, but a conservative reaction, national Catholicism, based on the army and the church to erase every trace of modernity. Yet his alliance with the church was strategic. When the deeply Catholic Basque nationalists demanded autonomy, Franco did not hesitate to bomb their cities and execute their priests. His obsession with a single Spain outweighed everything. While other right-wing dictatorships collapsed, Franco survived for decades, isolated but tolerated by the West during the Cold War as an anti-communist bulwark. He died in his bed in 1975, a long-lived tyrant whose death opened the doors to democracy. But if Franco's Spain was a brutal and conservative dictatorship, born in response to another ideology that also sought to impose itself as a dictatorship, to the east another tyranny was evolving into something far stranger, a grotesque nightmare, colourful and dominated by the delusional cult of a single man and his family. 700 architects and 20,000 workers to build the second largest building in the world, the Palace of the People. This monstrous empire of concrete is the testament to the madness of a single man, Nicolae Ceausescu. His rise was that of a skilled bureaucrat within an already existing system. The communist regime was imposed in Bucharest at the end of the Second World War. The advance of the Soviet Red Army forced the king to abdicate, effectively abolishing the monarchy. Romania thus became a solid communist dictatorship, but his predecessor, Gheorghe Odeș, had already begun to distance himself from Moscow, pursuing a nationalist line. Ceausescu, inheriting power in 1965, initially rode this wave. He condemned the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, earning the esteem of the West. But a visit to North Korea struck him deeply. Inspired by the cult of Kim Il-sung, he decided to replicate it. His idea turned into grotesque megalomania. He had himself called the genius of the Carpathians, while his wife, Elena, semi-illiterate, was promoted as a world-renowned scientist. His reign became a nightmare. Its worst practices were paranoia managed by the Securitate, a secret police with one informer for every 10 citizens, and a murderous austerity policy. To repay foreign debt, he shut off heating, rationed food, and left the streets in darkness, plunging the people into misery. The end was sparked by a single flame. In December 1989, a protest in the city of Timișoara was crushed in blood. To reassert his power, Ceausescu called a rally in Bucharest, but his speech was interrupted by the whistles of a crowd that had lost its fear. The signal, broadcast live on TV, triggered the revolution. The army sided with the people against the Securitate. After days of fighting, the dictator and his wife were captured, hastily tried, and executed by firing squad on Christmas Day. Thus ended the dictatorship in Romania. But at the opposite end of Europe, another dictatorship, far quieter and longer lasting, did not fall at the hands of a revolution, but under the weight of its own anachronistic obstinacy. For 41 years, Western Europe hosted its longest-lasting dictatorship, led not by a charismatic general, but by a stern and austere professor of economics, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. His rise began out of total chaos. The First Portuguese Republic was a powder keg of instability. Rampant inflation, constant strikes, and no fewer than 45 different governments in just 16 years. After a military coup that failed to solve the crisis, Salazar was appointed Minister of Finance. With iron discipline, he restored the nation's finances, earning a reputation as the saviour of the country. From that position, step by step, he took control of the state, founding his Estado Novo. It was not a fascism shouted from podiums, but an authoritarianism whispered through institutions, based on austere nationalism. His idea was to freeze Portugal in a rural and orderly past, far from both liberalism and communism. But that silence was enforced through terror. His worst practices were entrusted to the PIDE, his ruthless secret police. Total censorship, systematic torture, and the elimination of every dissident were the norm. The fatal mistake of the regime was its anachronistic stubbornness in keeping the colonial empire in Africa. Endless and bloody wars drained the country's resources and the army's morale. Salazar was sidelined by a domestic accident, yet his regime outlived him. In the end, it was the army captains who overthrew it on April 25, 1974. What made the Carnation Revolution almost unique in history was its nature. A military coup that, instead of bringing new repression, turned into a popular celebration. People filled the streets and offered red carnations to the soldiers, who placed them in the barrels of their rifles. It was a powerful image, the almost bloodless end of a dictatorship. But what happens when isolation is not a political choice, but becomes a state paranoia so total that it turns an entire nation into an open-air prison, sealed off from the rest of the world? But before discovering the last country and finally seeing the red thread that has connected all these dictatorships, while also taking a look at the current situation, if you found this video informative, we kindly ask you to support our project with a like, by subscribing to the channel and clicking the bell so you won't miss our new videos. And we also remind you of our new channel, America vs. Europe, where we compare all European countries, the United States and Canada under different factors. 750,000 bunkers, one for every 4 inhabitants. Not for an ongoing war, but for an imaginary war in the mind of a single man. Enver Hoxha. His rise was forged in the fire of the Second World War. Before the conflict, Albania was a young and fragile monarchy, a poor and rural country, prey first to fascist Italy's invasion and then to Nazi Germany's. In this chaos, Hoxha, an intellectual educated in France, became the charismatic leader of the communist partisan resistance. Like Tito, his legitimacy was born from having liberated his own country, and after the war he seized power with an iron grip. But his path was one of absolute darkness. While the rest of the communist bloc moved away from Stalin, Hoxha made Stalin his only divinity. His idea was an ideological madness, to create the world's only truly Stalinist state. To achieve this, he cut ties with everyone, first with revisionist Yugoslavia, then with the post-Stalin Soviet Union, and, finally, even with China. Albania became a planet of its own, the North Korea of Europe, sealed in a self-inflicted paranoia. His regime was one of sheer brutality, but his worst practice was the total war against God. With unprecedented violence, he eradicated every form of religion. Churches and mosques were demolished or turned into warehouses and gyms. Priests and imams were executed or sent to forced labour. Albania became the first and only constitutionally atheist state in history, where owning a sacred text was a crime punishable by death. While his people lived in poverty, he covered the country with reinforced concrete through his insane bunkerization project, maintaining daily terror through his omnipresent secret police, the Sigariemi. He died in his bed in 1985, but his ghost continued to rule. His successor, Ramiz Alia, attempted timid reforms, but the system was an empty shell. Inspired by the fall of the Berlin Wall, in 1990, students took to the streets. The protests became unstoppable, and the regime, rotten and isolated, crumbled, leaving behind a ruined nation, the poorest and most isolated in Europe. But now it is time to ask ourselves some fundamental questions. What allowed these dictatorships to take power? What did they have in common? And above all, are these dynamics reappearing in today's Europe? The answer is that none of these dictatorships is a mere accident of history. They are the symptom of a disease that emerges when a society is pushed to the breaking point. And this disease always shows common traits, both in right-wing and left-wing dictatorships. First, dictatorships often arise when there is an emergency to address. The emergencies that led to the dictatorships of the 20th century were mainly of four kinds: economic, national identity and pride, political instability, and the need to oppose other regimes or extremist ideas. But different periods may present different types of emergencies. What do you think are the most serious emergencies in today's Europe? And which ones are being used by some to justify anti-democratic measures? Second, to respond to this emergency, a powerful leader or strong values are required. The leader is no longer a politician, but becomes the voice of the people, the only person capable of interpreting the gut feelings of the nation and saving it. At the same time, we have seen how the same ideologies cut across several dictators and nations. Sometimes, in fact, power may not be embodied in a single person, but in an idea, in values, in political plans. And whoever opposes these plans and ideas is not an adversary, but an enemy who stands in the way of history's inevitable path. Third, a clear and visible enemy is created, and with this enemy there can be no debate. In fact, the most powerful ingredient is the disappearance of debate, replaced by a clash between good and evil. It is the belief that the other side, unlike me, is always and inevitably on the wrong side of history. It is the belief that one must be intolerant of the intolerant. Fourth, the rules are eroded. Not necessarily with a coup d'etat, but also with treaties, directives, and regulations. The most important thing, the fundamental ingredient, is that these regulations are decided far from the citizens. Democracy is slowly emptied from within, transforming national parliaments into mere executors of decisions made either by the single leader of that nation or elsewhere. Everything we have said so far leads us to the third and most important question: are these dynamics reappearing in today's Europe? The answer to this question we leave to you. Where in Europe do you think the risk of dictatorship is greatest? What are the biggest similarities you see between the stories we have told today and the present story of your nation? Speaking of economic emergencies and how they have influenced the present of our continent, we invite you to watch this video, where we look at 5 European countries that have literally been on the verge of bankruptcy in recent years. That is all for this video. See you next time.